People in Briar Hollow still said her name the way you say a warning. Evelyn Klein. Not loud, not dramatic, just careful, like the syllables could wake something up. The town had been built around coal, the way barnacles build around a ship. Everyone in Briar Hollow leaned toward the mine. Paychecks, marriages, grudges, church donations, even the local Little League uniforms that always seemed to have the same sponsor stitched onto the sleeve. When the mine breathed, the town breathed. When the mine coughed, everyone pretended it was seasonal. Evelyn didn't pretend well. She wasn't an activist. She didn't march. She didn't shout at meetings. She was a miner's wife with a tight bun, quick hands, and a kind of steady gaze that made people feel like they'd been seen all the way through, even when she said almost nothing. That was her power, really. Not charisma, not volume, attention. She noticed details the way some people notice weather. The soot that showed up earlier each winter, the new bruises on men who used to come home tired, but mostly intact. The way the company clinic started giving out vitamin shots that made folks sleepy, compliant, grateful. She noticed, too, how the wives at the grocery store spoke in shorter sentences whenever someone from management walked in. How the pastor's sermons got softer around the subject of justice. How the town paper ran more photos of ribbon cuttings than obituaries, even though the math didn't work. Evelyn was married to Cal Klein, a man who'd been underground since he was young enough to still believe that hard work could purchase safety. Cal was not a cruel man. He wasn't even a complicated man. He loved his wife. He loved their small house with a narrow porch. He loved the ritual of washing coal dust out of his hair like it was a daily rebirth. But he also loved one other thing that mattered in Briar Hollow, not making waves. In the late 70s, the mine was expanding. New seams, new equipment, new quotas. Management held meetings where they talked about modernization and growth. And the men nodded because nodding meant you kept your shift. Evelyn didn't nod, not in the way they wanted. It began with a small argument that nobody heard, because arguments in coal towns are usually swallowed by pride before they ever reach daylight. Evelyn had found a folded paper in Cal's jacket, an incident report he'd brought home by accident. It listed injuries, equipment failures, a ventilation issue that had been temporarily addressed. Evelyn read it the way people read their own medical results, with a quiet terror that hardens into clarity. Cal tried to take it back, tried to explain it away, said those papers were normal, that the company tracked everything, that it didn't mean anything worse than usual. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just asked a question that landed like a rock in a pond. If it doesn't mean anything, why did you hide it? Cal didn't have an answer that sounded good out loud. Over the next weeks, Evelyn started doing something that looked harmless, almost domestic. She started writing. Not letters to the editor, not manifestos, lists, dates when Cal came home coughing more than usual, names of men who'd stopped showing up to church, stories the wives told each other when they thought nobody was listening. She wrote down the name of the clinic nurse, who always seemed to appear at the exact right moment, offering calm words and paperwork. She wrote down the number of times the company doctor prescribed rest instead of asking questions. And she wrote down a single address she'd found through a cousin in a neighboring county, an attorney who handled workplace injuries, the kind of man the mine hated because he knew how to read a ledger like a crime scene. Evelyn planned to mail her notes, That, in Briar Hollow, was the same as striking a match near a gas leak. Cal found her envelope on the kitchen counter. He begged her to stop, not because he didn't believe her, but because he believed her too much. He knew what happened to people who made the company nervous. He'd seen men transferred to worse sections underground. He'd seen families suddenly lose their lease, as if paperwork could swallow a house. Evelyn listened. Then she did what she always did. She looked at him like she was choosing the most honest answer available. And she told him she couldn't raise a family in a town that trained everyone to be quiet. They didn't have children, not yet, but the idea of it lived between them. A soft hope. Evelyn used that hope like a knife. Cal went to work the next morning with a heaviness that wasn't just coal. That was the last day anyone saw Evelyn as herself. She vanished on a Tuesday, the kind of weekday that's supposed to be forgettable. Neighbors would later describe the morning in fragments, as if their brains couldn't hold the full picture without cracking. A woman at the market remembered Evelyn buying flour and canned peaches. Someone else remembered her at the post office, standing near the mail slots with an envelope in her hand. A third person remembered seeing her on the sidewalk outside the company clinic, not going in, just lingering like she was deciding whether the building was safe. By late afternoon, her house was quiet. Cal came home and called her name. No answer. Her grocery bag sat on the counter half unpacked, the way you leave it when you mean to come back in 1 minute. Her coat hung on its hook. Her purse was missing. The envelope with the notes was gone. Cal did what men do when they're trying to keep control over panic. He searched. He checked the neighbor's house. He walked down to the market. He drove to the clinic. He asked questions that sounded normal enough to pass without starting rumors. The people who answered him acted polite, but their eyes were careful. He went to the sheriff's office by nightfall. The sheriff at the time was a tired man who treated missing persons the way coal towns treat headaches, something you hope goes away if you ignore it long enough. He took Cal's report, asked routine questions, wrote down routine notes. Then he asked the question that always lands like an accusation, even when it's said gently. Did you two argue? Cal said yes, because lying felt worse. He admitted they'd fought. He admitted she'd been upset about the mine. The sheriff nodded like he'd expected it, like the puzzle piece clicked into a picture he already had. The search began, but it began small. A few deputies, a few volunteers, flashlights combing the edges and woods and creek beds. No one searched the mine's property deeply. No one searched the company clinic thoroughly. The town treated those places like churches. You don't accuse what feeds you. Within days, the story hardened into something easier. Evelyn left. Evelyn ran off. Evelyn had someone else. These stories spread because they protected the town's illusion that nothing truly dangerous could happen here unless you invited it. Cal became a man everyone recognized and no one wanted to speak to. He was not arrested, there was no evidence. But coal towns don't need evidence to decide your role in a tragedy. He kept working. He kept showing up. He kept washing the dust out of his hair every night, like he could rinse away suspicion. Sometimes on Sundays he sat alone on the back pew. The pastor avoided looking directly at him. The wives whispered. Cal endured it because in Briar Hollow endurance is religion. Months passed, then years. The case cooled the way coffee cools when you forget it. Slowly, silently, and then all at once it becomes something you can't drink anymore. Evelyn's name slipped into the category of things you mention quietly to scare teenagers into behaving. Don't walk near the clinic at night. Remember Evelyn. Don't pick fights with management. Remember Evelyn. Don't mail letters you shouldn't. Remember Evelyn. In the late 70s, the company clinic expanded. They added a wing. They repainted the entrance. They put up a sign about community wellness, as if wellness could be manufactured by changing fonts. And one thing about that expansion always struck the older folks as strange. One ward in the back stayed sealed. Not closed for renovation sealed. Sealed like a boundary. A heavy door, a set of keys that moved rarely. No windows, no visitors, no explanations. People called it the old isolation ward, left over from the days when mining towns feared outbreaks the way they feared strikes. Management called it storage. The clinic staff changed the subject. Years later, when the clinic became a proper hospital, the sealed ward remained sealed. Time moved. Briar Hollow survived recessions and booms, funerals and weddings, the slow draining away of young people. Cal aged into a man with a permanent crease between his brows, like grief had carved a place to live. He never remarried. He never moved. Every year on the same week Evelyn disappeared, he left a porch light on all night. He didn't do it for the town, he did it for himself. A small ritual that said, if you come back, the house will still recognize you. Decades later, the mine's ownership changed. Corporations traded the town like a card in a stack. The hospital changed administrators. Records moved into new systems. Old paper became archive, which is just a polite word for we don't want to think about it. And then, in the present day, a renovation crew arrived, not at a house, at the hospital. The hospital needed updates. New electrical, new plumbing, new compliance. The administration wanted to convert unused space into offices and storage. The sealed ward in the back had become a rumor, even among staff. A curiosity you mentioned during break, half joking, half uncomfortable. The crew assigned to the project included a contractor named Mason Ward. Mason was not from Briar Hollow originally. He'd grown up 2 counties over, far enough away to love the mountains without being owned by them. He had that practical calm that comes from years of solving problems no one else wanted. He was the type to notice a crooked hinge and immediately wonder who tried to hide it. On the first day, Mason stood in the back corridor of the hospital and looked at the sealed ward door. It was old, heavy. Its paint had been layered over many times, but you could see the history in the way it held light. A sign on it read, "Authorized personnel only," but the letters had faded into meaninglessness. Mason asked the facilities manager why it was sealed. The manager shrugged, said it had been shut down long ago, said it wasn't up to code, said no one needed it. Mason asked who had keys. The manager hesitated, then admitted there were keys in a safe somewhere, but no one had used them in years. The hesitation was the first interesting detail. Mason had learned that people don't hesitate about nothing. They hesitate about discomfort. He pushed gently, not aggressively, the way you do when you want someone's truth to come out on its own. The manager said the old ward had sensitive history, that it was better left alone, that everyone was busy, that this renovation had a timeline. Mason nodded like he accepted it. Then later he did what he always did. He checked the building plans. The plans were incomplete. Parts of the hospital had been updated and digitized, but the oldest wing lived in a messy stack of paper binders stored in a basement room that smelled of damp cardboard and stale toner. Mason flipped through. Most of it was boring. Plumbing routes, conduit runs, fire exits. Then he found a floor map from the late 70s, and there it was. The sealed ward had a name, not storage, not isolation. Ward 7. And beside it, in small handwriting that looked like an afterthought, a note. Keep log separate. Mason felt a prickling at the base of his neck. He didn't know why yet, but his instincts were pulling on a thread. He asked an older hospital nurse about Ward 7. The nurse was near retirement. Her name was Lorna, and she had the slightly distant eyes of someone who had seen too much pain to keep it all in focus. She paused when Mason mentioned the ward. Lorna didn't say, "I don't know." She said, "Nobody talks about that." Then she walked away as if she'd already said too much. That reaction did more for Mason than any blueprint could. He began asking questions quietly. He learned that in the late 70s, the hospital was still called the company clinic, that the hospital's board had included mine representatives, that the clinic had served the town, yes, but it had also served the mine, protecting its workforce, protecting its reputation, protecting its liability. Mason did not yet know Evelyn's name. He did not yet know the story of Foxglove Lane rituals and whispered warnings, but he knew enough to understand a basic principle. If a place is sealed for decades, it's not always because it's unsafe. Sometimes it's because it's embarrassing. Sometimes it's because it's incriminating. Weeks into renovation, the hospital administration decided to finally address Ward 7. They planned to gut the space and turn it into storage for medical supplies. The facilities manager, pressured by budget, brought out the key ring from the safe. The keys were old and heavy, the kind that make a sound that feels like history. Mason was there when they opened the door. The lock resisted at first, as if it had grown stubborn in isolation. Then it turned with a groan that sounded almost human. The door swung inward. Air came out that smelled like dust and old disinfectant, a chemical ghost. Ward 7 was a corridor of small rooms, dim even with flashlights. The paint on the walls had yellowed. The floor had that dull, worn look of a place cleaned repeatedly long ago and then abandoned to time. Beds sat in rooms like forgotten props. Cabinets remained closed. Curtains hung stiff. It wasn't a horror scene. Not blood, not gore. Something colder. Neglect. Silence. Preservation. Mason walked the corridor slowly. He noticed scuff marks on the floor where beds had been moved. He noticed a broken clock on the wall, hands frozen on an hour that meant nothing now. He noticed most of all that someone had tried to clean before sealing it. The surfaces were dusty but not chaotic. The place had been shut down deliberately, not abandoned in a rush. In the far end room, a metal cabinet stood against the wall, its doors secured by a simple latch. The latch was newer than the cabinet. Mason frowned. Newer latches mean someone came back after the closing and wanted something to stay shut. He asked the facilities manager to photograph everything for documentation. The manager muttered about budget but agreed. Hospitals fear liability more than they fear ghosts. Mason opened the cabinet. Inside there were binders, old ones, thick, labeled with dates in neat handwriting. And there, on the top binder, a label that made Mason's stomach tighten even before he understood why. Ward 7 log. Under it, another binder. Admissions restricted. And under that, a final item. A thin book wrapped in brown paper, sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed into brittleness. Mason did not open the paper-wrapped book immediately. He held it as if it were fragile, not because of age, but because of what it might contain. The facilities manager asked if it was important. Mason said yes, in the calm voice of someone trying not to reveal urgency. He told the manager it needed to go to administration. He watched the manager walk away with it. And he watched that thin book disappear into a world of desks and closed doors, which is where inconvenient truths go to die. Mason did not accept that. That night, after his shift, he sat in his truck outside the hospital and searched local history online. Not deep research, just basic keywords. Ward 7, company clinic, sealed ward. The results were sparse, but one old forum post caught his attention. A thread about Briar Hollow disappearances. Someone mentioned a miner's wife who vanished in the late 70s. Someone wrote her name, Evelyn Klein, and someone else replied with a single sentence that hit Mason like a slap. My grandma said the clinic took her. Mason read that line 3 times. Clinic took her. Not she went to the clinic. Not she was found at the clinic. Took. The next day, Mason returned to the hospital administration office and asked about the paper-wrapped book. The administrator, a polished man with a smile practiced enough to feel like a costume, said the book was archival and would be handled appropriately. Mason asked where it was now. The administrator said it was being assessed. Mason asked by whom. The administrator's smile tightened. He said, in a gentle voice, that contractors didn't need to worry about medical records. That was when Mason understood the true nature of Ward 7. It wasn't just old space, it was old liability, and the hospital still carried fear of it. Mason did not argue. He nodded and left. Then he did something he hated doing. He pushed past official channels. He asked Lorna, the older nurse, if she knew about Evelyn Klein. Lorna's face changed, not into shock, into something older, like resignation. She told Mason she'd been a young aide in the late 70s, not working Ward 7 directly, but close enough to see the edges of it. She told him Ward 7 wasn't for infections. It wasn't for flu outbreaks. It was for problem cases, people who threatened the mind's stability, people who talked too much, people who wouldn't sign papers. Lorna did not say this with drama. She said it with the flat tone of someone confessing something that had been weighing on her for decades. She told Mason there had been a woman brought in one afternoon by 2 men in work jackets, not by ambulance. The woman was not bleeding. She was not obviously injured, but she looked terrified. They said she was unstable, said she'd been hysterical, said she needed observation. Those words in the late 70s were a magic spell. Observation meant containment. Containment meant silence. Lorna remembered the woman's hair, the way it was pinned, the way her eyes moved, sharp and scanning like she was memorizing exits. She didn't remember her name, but she remembered something else. After that woman arrived, Ward 7 was locked down tighter. More paperwork, more stern faces, more don't ask questions. Mason asked Lorna if records existed. Lorna said records existed, but not in the system people used. Ward 7 kept its own log, separate, as the blueprint note had said. Mason told Lorna about the paper-wrapped book. Lorna's mouth tightened. She said that sounded like the real log, not the sanitized binder. The real one that contained the names and details management didn't want to be searchable. Mason asked if the hospital would destroy it. Lorna didn't answer directly. Her silence was enough. Mason left that day with a plan that felt both necessary and reckless. He called someone from outside, a journalist, not a national one, someone local, hungry, persistent, and not bought by the town's fear. Her name was Tessa Rowe, and she ran a small investigative podcast that mostly covered property fraud and crooked sheriffs. She liked cases that smelled like secrets. When Mason told her about Ward 7, she didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss. She got quiet. Then she asked him a question that told Mason she understood the stakes immediately. Do you have the book? Mason said no, not yet. Tessa said then you need it before it disappears. 2 days later, the hospital announced Ward 7 renovation would pause due to archival review. Mason knew what that meant. Pause meant delay. Delay meant time. Time meant shredders. That night, Mason returned to the hospital under the excuse of retrieving a tool he'd left behind. He had permission to enter the back wing because contractors were always in and out. He moved through the building the way you move through a place you've worked long enough to blend into it. He went to Ward 7. The door was locked again. He had a copy of the key now, made earlier for work access. Not stolen. Official. The kind of key that becomes dangerous only because of where it takes you. He opened the door quietly. He walked the corridor with a flashlight and a pulse that refused to calm down. The cabinet where the binders had been was empty. All of it. Gone. His stomach dropped, then recovered into anger. They were already cleaning history. Mason searched. He checked adjacent rooms, storage closets, a janitorial nook. He found nothing. Then, at the far end, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before, a vent cover on the wall that looked recently disturbed, slightly crooked, screws with cleaner metal. He removed the vent cover carefully. Inside, tucked behind ductwork, was the thin, paper-wrapped book. Someone had hidden it quickly, not to destroy it immediately, but to control when it vanished. Mason held it, hands sweating. The tape seal on the brown paper had become brittle, ready to crack. He didn't open it in the hospital. He left. He drove straight to Tessa Rowe's small studio, a rented room above a closed antique store, the kind of place where secrets are handled with cheap coffee and stubbornness. Tessa looked at the paper-wrapped book like it was a living thing. They opened it together. Inside was a ledger, old paper, thin lines, ink that had bled slightly with time. The first pages were orderly, dates, bed numbers, staff initials. Then it became something else, names, not just patient names, notes about company directives, notes about release not authorized, notes about transfer by instruction. And there, on a page that made Tessa inhale sharply, was a name Mason recognized now like a bruise. Evelyn Klein. The log listed her admission as voluntary, but the handwriting beside it told a different story. A note. Arrived accompanied. Patient refuses forms. Another note days later. Patient requesting legal counsel. Denied. Another. Patient requests husband contacted. Denied. Tessa turned the pages slowly, eyes narrowing, mouth tightening as if reading could injure her. Mason felt a sick heaviness. Evelyn hadn't simply disappeared. She had been taken into an official building and erased with paperwork. The log detailed the ward's routines, sedation schedules, quiet hours, compliance observed. It included a section of names that appeared repeatedly, some with the same note. Mine-related agitation. Tessa realized what it meant. These were not mental health crises. These were people reacting to something toxic, something harmful, something the mine wanted to label as instability rather than injury. And then the log changed tone near the middle. It mentioned an event underground. An incident that injured several men, though the town paper had called it a minor disruption. The ward filled. The notes became faster, more urgent. One entry chilled Tessa enough that she set the book down briefly as if it had weight. Ward sealed by order. After that, the log became sparse, short, clipped notes. Visitors prohibited. Staff rotated. Records to be separate. Then, weeks later, a final entry under Evelyn's name. Transfer arranged. Patient moved. No contact. No destination listed. No discharge. No death certificate. Just moved. Tessa and Mason stared at that line like it might change if they looked longer. Then Tessa did what good investigators do. She asked the next question. Transferred where? They went back through the ledger and found a repeated set of initials next to transfers. A doctor. Not a psychiatrist. Not a general physician. A specialist whose title suggested occupational medicine. A mind doctor. The kind of doctor who exists to keep workers functional, not necessarily well. Tessa searched old licensing records and found the doctor's name. He was long dead, but the doctor's former address, his old practice location, still existed as a building. A small office on the edge of Briar Hollow, now abandoned. The next day they went there. The office smelled of mold and old carpet. The sign outside had been removed, but the shadow of it remained on the wall like a ghost of authority. Inside, most of the cabinets had been emptied, but in a desk drawer, Tessa found something that felt almost too perfect, like the kind of breadcrumb left by accident because evil is often lazy. A carbon copy receipt for a patient transport service. No names, but a destination. A facility in a neighboring county, one that no longer operated. An old psychiatric hospital. Not the kind with modern patient rights and oversight. The kind people used to threaten each other with in whispered jokes. Tessa and Mason drove to the facility. It sat on a hill, behind rusted fencing. Windows boarded, paint peeling. The place felt like it was holding its breath. They didn't break in. They didn't trespass deep. Tessa wasn't trying to become the story. She wanted proof, not headlines about her own arrest. But outside, near the back service entrance, she found something in the weeds. An old metal tag, the kind hospitals use to tie to patient files, stamped with a number. The same number appeared in the Ward 7 ledger next to Evelyn's transfer entry. That was enough to confirm direction, not conclusion. They needed more. Tessa went to county archives and requested the old facility's admission records. The clerk told her most paper records had been destroyed years ago. Some had been digitized, some had been lost. Tessa kept pushing, persistent enough to be irritating. Finally, an older archivist said there was one section that had been kept. A binder of unresolved discharges. Patients transferred out with incomplete paperwork. Tessa's hands shook when she opened it. Evelyn Klein was not listed by name, but a woman with Evelyn's birth date and physical description was, under a different name, under the note, identity protected per directive. Protected from whom? Tessa knew. She didn't need it spelled out. Protected from the public. Protected from the husband. Protected from anyone who might search. The binder included one more detail, a note that the woman had been moved again later to a care home under a charity program. And there, unbelievably, was the care home's name. It still existed, now rebranded as an assisted living center. Mason sat in Tessa's studio with the ledger open on the table and felt something strange rise in him. Hope, thin but alive. Evelyn might have lived. Not free, not whole, but alive. Tessa was careful with the next step. She didn't barge into the care home with a microphone. She contacted them formally, using legal language and privacy compliance. She requested confirmation of whether a resident had once been admitted under the alias. The care home refused to answer, citing confidentiality. Tessa expected that, so she changed tactics. She searched obituaries. She searched burial records. She searched the alias name and found nothing. No death record, no burial, no obituary. That absence was suspicious in its own way, because death paperwork is hard to hide forever unless someone is helping hide it, or unless the person is still alive. Tessa and Mason traveled to the care home anyway, not demanding answers, but looking for a human opening. The care home sat in a quiet town where people kept gardens and spoke softly. It smelled like sanitizer and soup. At the front desk, Tessa introduced herself as a journalist investigating historical medical misconduct, careful not to mention Evelyn's name aloud where others could hear. The receptionist listened with polite discomfort, then called an administrator. The administrator, a woman with a practiced calm, repeated the confidentiality line, but her eyes flicked just once toward the hallway. That flick was not proof, but it was direction. Tessa asked gently if the facility had any residents who had been there for decades under protected identity. The administrator said she could not confirm. Tessa asked if there were any residents who had come from the old psychiatric hospital. The administrator repeated the line. Then, after a pause that felt like a moral argument happening inside her, she said one thing, quietly, carefully, while keeping her face neutral. There's a resident who likes to sit by the window at the end of the East Hall. She enjoys visitors. She enjoys hearing stories about mountains. It wasn't permission. It wasn't denial. It was the closest thing to human mercy. Tessa and Mason walked down the East Hall. At the window, an elderly woman sat in a chair with a blanket across her lap. Her hair was thin, white, pinned back in a way that reminded Mason of the late 70s photo he'd found online. Her hands were folded, and her posture had the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Tessa approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. The woman looked up. Her eyes were sharp, still, not confused, not vacant, sharp in the way Evelyn's eyes had been described by everyone who remembered her. Tessa introduced herself and Mason in simple terms. She didn't mention missing persons. She didn't mention the mine. She talked about mountains, about quiet towns, about how sometimes places keep secrets for too long. The woman listened. Her gaze stayed steady. Then she asked, in a voice that was thin but clear, if they were from Briar Hollow. Tessa said yes. The woman's hands tightened slightly on the blanket. She looked out the window, not at them, like she needed distance to speak. She said she hadn't used that town's name in a long time. Tessa asked gently what name she preferred. The woman hesitated. Then she said, almost with a faint bitterness, that she'd had many names. Names people gave her when they wanted her to disappear without dying. Tessa took a breath. She asked if she had ever been called Evelyn. The woman did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not ask how Tessa knew. She simply closed her eyes for a second, as if acknowledging something inevitable. Then she nodded. Mason felt the air change. This was not a ghost story. This was a living person with a stolen life. Evelyn did not pour her story out in one clean timeline. Trauma doesn't do that. It comes in fragments, in images, in feelings that break into words when they can. She told them she had tried to mail evidence. She told them she had been watched. She told them that On the day she disappeared, she had felt the town's eyes shift, like something had decided she was dangerous. She said she remembered going to the post office. She remembered holding her envelope and feeling, for the first time, truly afraid. She remembered a car stopping near her, a man speaking politely as if offering help. She remembered waking up in the clinic with paperwork in front of her and voices telling her she was confused, that she had a breakdown, that she needed rest. She said she refused to sign anything. She said that was when the kindness left. She described Ward 7 without calling it that. A corridor, locked doors, lights that never felt like daylight, medicine that made thoughts thick, staff who avoided her eyes. She said she asked to call her husband, denied. She said she asked for a lawyer, denied. She said she asked if she was under arrest. They laughed. Evelyn described how the ward filled after a mine incident. Men brought in coughing, shaking, sometimes bleeding, always treated like burdens. She described the mine doctor walking through the ward with a clipboard, looking at patients like damaged tools. She said she realized then that the ward was not about care, it was about control. Then she described the transfer, no choice, a ride in the back of a van, a new facility, a new name. She said she tried to resist, but resistance is difficult when everyone around you holds keys and your body is tired from chemical calm. She said she lived for years in that other hospital, not chained, not beaten, but managed as if her will was something to be medicated away. She said one staff member there, an aide with a conscience, helped her contact the outside once, but the letter never reached anyone. Or it did, and someone intercepted it. Evelyn said that was where she understood the deepest cruelty. They didn't need to kill her. They just needed to remove her voice. Eventually, she said, the old psychiatric hospital started shutting down sections. Funding changed. Regulations shifted. The world moved forward in small administrative steps that saved some people by accident. Evelyn was moved again, placed in the care home under charity, still under protected identity. She stopped fighting openly because fighting only brought consequences, but she never forgot her real name. She kept it like a coal ember in her chest, waiting. Tessa asked Evelyn if she wanted to contact Cal. Evelyn's face tightened in a way that was not anger, not exactly. Something more complicated? She said she had thought about Cal for decades. She had imagined him thinking she ran off. She had imagined him thinking she betrayed him. She had imagined him thinking she died. She said that at first she wanted to go home more than she wanted air. Then, as years passed, she feared what she would find. She feared Cal would be dead. She feared the town would have built a story that had no room for the truth. She feared, too, something practical. She feared the mind's shadow, because even decades later, that shadow could reach. People who hid her had not been saints. They had been systems. But now, with the ledger in Tessa's possession, and with hospital administration already scrambling, the system's grip was weaker. Evelyn asked a question that hit Mason hard. Is he still alive? Tessa didn't know. She hadn't checked yet. She had assumed without thinking that Cal would be long gone. That night, Tessa searched records. Cal Klein was still alive. Old, retired, living in the same house on Foxglove Lane, still leaving a porch light on. When Tessa told Evelyn didn't cry loudly. She didn't break down. She simply covered her mouth with her hand and stared, as if the concept of him being alive was almost painful to accept. She said she would see him, but she didn't want cameras. She didn't want crowds. She didn't want a spectacle. She wanted a door, a porch, a light. Tessa arranged the meeting privately with legal support. She planned it like a negotiation with history because it was. Mason drove Evelyn back toward Briar Hollow in a quiet car with a quiet journalist, and the mountains outside the window looked the same as they always had. Beautiful, indifferent, ancient. As they approached the town, Evelyn's hands trembled slightly. She said she hadn't realized how much she missed the simple shape of the hills. They arrived near Foxglove Lane at dusk. The street looked smaller than it would have in the late 70s, or maybe Evelyn's memory had enlarged it. Memory does that. It changes scale to fit emotion. Cal's house still stood. The porch light was on. Cal opened the door before they reached the steps, as if he'd been standing behind it, waiting for years. He was older now. His shoulders sloped, his hair thin, but his eyes were the same eyes from the few old photographs Tessa had found. He looked at Evelyn and did not speak at first. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His face shifted as if trying to fit an impossible image into reality. Evelyn said his name. That was enough. Cal stepped forward slowly. His hands rose as if he didn't know where to put them. He didn't touch her immediately as if afraid she would disappear again. Then he did. Not violently, not desperately. Just a careful, shaking embrace like a man holding something fragile that he feared the world might steal again. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouted accusations. Life isn't that clean. Cal's face pressed into Evelyn's hair. He made a sound that was half breath, half grief. Evelyn closed her eyes. Her shoulders loosened as if a long-held tension had finally been allowed to rest. Later, inside the house, they sat at the kitchen table. Tessa stayed quiet. Mason stayed near the door, present but not intruding. Cal listened to Evelyn in pieces. His expression changed as the story revealed itself. Shock, then anger, then a kind of hollow disbelief that settled into understanding. When Evelyn spoke about being taken into the clinic and denied contact, Cal's eyes filled in a way that made him look suddenly young again, not because he was youthful, but because the hurt was fresh. He said he'd gone to the clinic that day. He said they told him she wasn't there. He said he had believed them because believing felt safer than imagining the alternative. Evelyn told him she had never left him by choice. Cal nodded slowly, as if his body was absorbing a truth it had needed for decades. When Evelyn spoke about Ward 7 and the transfer and the new name, Cal's hands clenched, not at her, at the system. He said he suspected the mine had done something, but he never had proof. He said the sheriff treated him like a problem, not a victim. He said the town treated him like an offender. He said he had lived inside that suspicion like a second skin. Evelyn reached across the table and held his hand. That small gesture did something bigger than any courtroom could. The next part of the story did become public, but carefully. Tessa published an investigation that focused on institutional misconduct. The clinic, the ward, the record separation, the mining company's influence on healthcare. She did not sensationalize Evelyn's trauma. She did not turn her into a headline. She built a narrative around records, patterns, and accountability. The Ward 7 ledger became evidence. Hospital administration tried to claim it was incomplete, tried to say it lacked context, tried to frame it as historical practices, but Tessa had the transfer traces, the facility records, the paper trail that lived in forgotten archives, and Evelyn was alive. That made denial harder. The mine's current corporate ownership issued a statement distancing itself from past operations, and they offered sympathy. They offered committees. They offered review. Briar Hollow responded in its own messy way. Some people apologized to Cal in awkward, clumsy sentences that sounded like they were trying to fix decades with a handshake. Some people insisted the past was the past, as if time washes guilt by default. Some people acted angry at Evelyn for reopening wounds the town had learned to step around. Those people were not evil. They were scared. They feared what truth might cost. But others, especially the wives of miners who had died coughing, heard Evelyn's story and felt something ignite. Not revenge, recognition. They began bringing forward their own quiet documentation, old injury notes, strange medical instructions, clinic experiences that had never sat right. The Ward 7 ledger did not just solve Evelyn's disappearance. It cracked open a broader truth that the mine had used medical systems to manage humans like assets. There were hearings, some lawsuits, some settlements. Not enough, never enough, but something. Evelyn did not become a public figure. She didn't want it. She had spent too long being controlled by narratives other people wrote. She stayed with Cal. They did not pretend the missing decades could be erased. They could not. Time is not a hallway you can walk backward through. But they did something quietly radical. They lived. They sat on the porch in the evenings. Cal made coffee. Evelyn watched the street and let herself exist in daylight again. Sometimes neighbors walked by and stared, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't know how to fit this miracle into their understanding of the world. Evelyn didn't perform for them. She didn't offer easy closure. She simply nodded when she felt like it. In late autumn, Mason returned to Briar Hollow to finish hospital renovation work. Ward 7 was no longer a sealed rumor. It was a documented history. The corridor had been cleaned, inspected, and locked under new policy. The ledger was in state custody. Mason stood in the back hallway one afternoon and listened. The hospital sounded like any hospital. Footsteps, carts, muffled voices, the soft beeping of machines in distant rooms. He realized with a strange heaviness that places can hide anything when people agree not to look. He had not come to Briar Hollow intending to change history. He had come to run electrical and install doors. But the truth doesn't always choose heroes. Sometimes it chooses a person who notices a newer latch on an older cabinet. Sometimes it chooses someone who refuses to accept that sealed means empty. Months later, Evelyn visited the hospital once, accompanied by Tessa and a counselor, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she needed to see it with her own eyes, the place that had tried to erase her. She stood outside the Ward 7 door for a long time. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cathartic in a movie way. It was simply a woman facing a boundary that had held her captive for years and realizing that it was now just a door, old, heavy, but no longer sacred. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. She turned away, walked back into sunlight, and said something quietly to Tessa that became later the final line of Tessa's published episode. They wanted me to disappear without a grave, but they forgot how stubborn a name can be. Evelyn Klein had vanished in the late 70s. Decades later, a sealed ward log book was found. And in a town built to worship quiet, a woman's story finally made noise, steady, undeniable, and alive.